Okay, so have you ever felt like you're juggling way too many things at once? Like every time you kind of get a grip, someone just throws something else at you.
Oh, yeah.
And then like the thought of saying no feels as impossible as, parallel parking a spaceship or something.
I feel that.
Right. So I think a lot of us can relate to that. And it all comes down to boundaries or, well, the lack of them, really.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And in this deep dive, we're going to really get into boundaries.
Yeah.
What they are, why they're so important, how they develop, some of the issues that we run into, and some really practical ways to start setting better boundaries.
Yes. And we are going to be talking about the book Boundaries. When to say yes, how to say no to take control of your life. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding this whole idea without having to read, the entire book. We're pulling out those actionable insights, those like, aha moments that you can use right away.
So let's just jump right into it. What exactly is a boundary?
Okay, so the book uses this analogy that I think really helps. Think of your boundaries like property lines, like the lines that show where your yard ends and your neighbor's begins. You can look at the deed and know exactly what you're responsible for and what's your neighbor's responsibility.
That is a perfect analogy, and it's the same for like our emotional and spiritual lives too. Boundaries define where you end and someone else begins.
Right.
And they protect your well-being, that sense of self. And what's really interesting is that boundaries aren't just about what you are responsible for. Your feelings, your choices, your actions, they're also about what you are not responsible for.
Oh, that's such a good point.
Yeah, think about it. How often do you try to like fix things for other people?
Oh, all the time.
Thinking you're helping, right?
Yeah.
But are you actually preventing them from like learning from their own experiences? That's a key part of boundaries, letting others own their stuff, even when it's hard.
Yes. No other control. I love how the book puts that. You can't take responsibility for other people's emotions or their decisions.
Right.
It's so easy to try to manage all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
To smooth things over,
Yeah.
make everyone happy.
For sure.
But it's not really our job to do that.
It's not. And it's also important to understand that boundaries aren't like walls. They're not meant to totally shut people out.
Right.
The book ties this to that idea in the Bible about being one in community.
Yeah.
But even in a healthy community, each person needs their own space.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The key is that those lines are open enough for connection, but strong enough to prevent harm or, people taking advantage.
The book gives this example of Sherry, who's already super busy. And then Phyllis from church calls with a last-minute volunteer request. And Sherry just drops everything. And, she wasn't totally honest about how much she actually had going on. I think a lot of others have been there, that automatic yes, even when it leaves you feeling totally drained.
Totally. And the book outlines a few key things that are essential for building those boundaries. Things like the power of our words, especially no, which we'll talk more about.
Yeah.
And truth understanding, God's principles and the way the world works.
Okay.
Time, creating space for yourself, emotional distance, which can be temporary but really important, and involving people who can support you as you set those boundaries.
So speaking of no, the book calls it the most basic boundary setting word. And it really is. It's just a tiny little word.
Right.
But it's so powerful.
It's huge. What's powerful about no is that it shows that you exist separately, that you have control over your life and your choices.
I love that.
Like when a baby learns to say no, it's a real declaration of independence. And the book talks about how no can feel confrontational, but it's absolutely necessary.
It is. Especially to set limits on what's acceptable behavior, even when it comes to things like abuse. And the book actually uses some biblical principles to show how important it is to confront people when you need to and to say no to things that are wrong. But it also gets into why saying no is so hard for so many people. You see this with Jim in the book, who really wanted to say no to all these demands on his time, but he just felt stuck. And then there's Wendy, who would rehearse what she was going to say in her head, but then when the moment came, she would just freeze up.
And Wendy's experience shows how important it is to have those supportive relationships. When you're trying to set boundaries, you can't do it alone.
You can't. We need to feel like we belong, like we're safe.
Right.
So how do boundaries actually develop? The book says that they grow in those nurturing relationships, and it goes through the different stages of how this happens in childhood, starting with hatching.
Okay, yeah, hatching.
Yeah.
That's when a baby starts to realize, wait, mom and I are not the same person. That's a huge step. That's when they might, start exploring things more rather than just focusing on mom or dad.
Yeah.
And that realization of me versus not me is where all healthy boundaries start.
Wow.
If that gets messed up, it can really cause problems later on with figuring out your needs and wants.
So then there's the practicing stage where toddlers get mobile.
Yeah.
They want to explore everything.
They're all over the place.
And the book says it's so important for parents to set clear boundaries, but without crushing that natural curiosity. Having a safe play area for a kid lets them explore without getting into real danger.
Right. The book uses this great analogy about baby's first steps.
Okay.
We often picture a wobbly baby reaching out for mom or dad.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, most parents see their baby's first steps from behind. The baby walks away from safety towards something new. And those physical boundaries, moving dangerous things out of the way, help them learn to be independent within safe limits.
Right. But that energy can't last forever. Eventually, the child hits the rapprochement phase.
Yeah.
That's when they realize, okay, I can't do everything I want.
Right.
The world gets a little bigger, maybe a little scarier.
A little less magical.
Yeah. And they realize they still need their parents.
Exactly. And that rapprochement phase, it's usually between 18 months and 3 years old.
Okay.
That's when no really takes off. It's one of the first boundaries kids learn to use with words. And parents have a really important role here. They need to create a space where their kid feels safe to say no.
That makes sense.
And they also need to respect their child's no when it makes sense. Not take it personally.
Right.
If your toddler says no to a hug, you don't want to get all upset.
Right. It's about respecting that.
Exactly.
The book also talks about adolescence and young adulthood, how those are times when boundaries get renegotiated, with things like identity, relationships, and all that. But it stresses how much easier it is if a child learns these skills early on.
Definitely. It makes such a difference. And on the flip side, the book talks about how damaging it can be when parents criticize a child for trying to set boundaries.
Right.
Or if they don't have consistent boundaries themselves.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
That can make kids either really passive or they might become controlling. And it also discusses how things like trauma or a dysfunctional family, like maybe alcoholism, can really mess with boundary development. It makes you feel insecure and confused about what you're actually responsible for.
So what are some of the ways that boundary problems show up? The book talks about compliance.
Okay, yeah. Compliance are the people who can't say no, even when it's bad for them.
Right.
They have blurry boundaries and kind of get lost in what other people want.
Oh, that makes sense.
Robert in the book is a good example. He was going broke trying to keep up with his wife's spending because he just couldn't say no to her.
Oh.
The book makes this interesting point that sometimes compliance will actually give up their own power as a way to try to control others. Oh, that's interesting.
It's if they please everyone, then maybe they'll get what they want in the end.
Right. A roundabout way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then there's the controllers. They're the opposite.
Yeah.
They don't respect other people's boundaries. To them, no is like a challenge. Oh, you think you can tell me no?
Right.
Steve in the book was like that with his assistant, Frank. He'd expect Frank to work late without pay, call him during dinner, all sorts of stuff. What's interesting about controllers is that they often have a hard time taking responsibility for their own lives.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So they put that on other people.
Yeah.
And they use all sorts of, tactics to get people to do what they want. But controllers often end up lonely because people are only around them out of obligation, not because they genuinely like them.
That's sad.
Yeah.
The book also briefly mentions a couple of other patterns, like the compliant who gets taken advantage of by a manipulative controller.
Kathy and Sharon are like that. And then there's the compliant who's in a relationship with someone who's just not responsive. Marcia and Tammy are an example of that.
Right, right. So the book lays out 10 laws of boundaries. Let's hit a few of the big ones.
Okay.
The law of sowing and reaping is a big one. It means our actions have consequences. And when we violate boundaries, we mess with that law. If you constantly bail your friend out of debt, you're not letting them face the consequences of their actions. They don't learn.
Right.
And then there's the law of responsibility. We're responsible to people, to love them, support them, but we're responsible for ourselves.
Right. That's a really important distinction.
It is. We're not responsible for another adult's life. And if you try to be, you're going to end up resentful.
Yeah.
The law of power reminds us that we can't actually change other people.
So
We
true.
should focus on ourselves.
Well, I need to remember that one.
Right. Then there's the law of respect. It's basically the golden rule for boundaries.
Right.
Respect other people's boundaries if you want them to respect yours.
Right. It has to go both ways.
Exactly. The law of motivation is all about why we set boundaries.
Okay.
It should come from love, not fear.
Yes.
Love for yourself and others.
Not because you're afraid of what will happen if you don't.
Right. The law of evaluation says to look at the results of setting boundaries. It might hurt feelings at first, but it often leads to something better.
Right. Like in the book with Jason, who decided to leave his business partnership.
Yeah, exactly. It might be hard in the short term, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. Then you have the law of activity. This one reminds us that we're not just sitting here letting things happen to us.
Right.
We have a choice. We can act.
Yes.
If you're too passive, you can't set boundaries, and bad things can keep happening.
Yeah. And lastly, the law of exposure. This is all about communicating your boundaries clearly and directly. Don't just hint or hope people will get it.
Exactly. You got to be upfront about it.
Now, there are also a lot of misconceptions about boundaries. One big one is that they're selfish.
Oh, yeah.
But the book says it's actually the opposite. It's about taking care of the gifts you've been given so you can contribute to the world.
Cigarette chip.
Right.
Exactly.
It's not selfish to protect what's important to you. Another myth, especially for religious people, is that boundaries are disobedient.
Right.
But the book argues that if you can't say no, your yes might not be genuine.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Like, are you truly agreeing if you feel like you don't have a choice?
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. And I think a lot of people worry that setting boundaries will hurt other people, but the book makes it clear that boundaries are for protection, not for attacking.
Yeah, they're defensive, not offensive.
Right. And saying no to someone might be inconvenient for them, but it's not hurting them.
Exactly. There's a difference between hurt and harm. And then there's the idea that boundaries equal anger.
You know, it's true. Anger can be a sign that a boundary's been crossed. But setting a boundary isn't the same as being angry. And the more you do it, the less reactive you become.
Right. And finally, the guilt. That feeling of guilt when you start setting boundaries.
Oh, yeah.
The book explains that this guilt might be coming from your past. You know, maybe you grew up in a place where your boundaries weren't respected. But that guilt doesn't mean you're doing something wrong now.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do these boundaries work in different relationships? Starting with friendships, the book emphasizes honesty and open communication.
Yeah. Real friendships are based on mutual respect, not guilt trips.
Right, and setting good boundaries can actually make those friendships stronger.
It really can.
When it comes to marriage, the book says that a lack of boundaries is one of the biggest reasons why marriages fail.
It's so true.
And it stresses that both people need to take responsibility for their own feelings and communicate them directly, rather than blaming each other.
Direct communication. That's key. And the book applies those 10 laws to marriage, too.
Oh.
Like, the law of sowing and reaping can explain how one person's bad behavior can be, like, accidentally encouraged by the other person's reactions.
Oh, interesting.
And the law of power reminds us that nagging doesn't work.
Yep.
It's better to focus on your own behavior and set those boundaries.
So what kind of boundaries are we talking about in a marriage?
Oh, there's physical intimacy, of course.
Right.
But also how you talk to each other, how you spend your time both together and apart.
Yeah.
Emotional boundaries like empathy and forgiveness. Spiritual boundaries like, are you on the same page?
Okay.
And finances, like, who's responsible for what?
And then there's the whole idea of leaving and cleaving, you know, becoming independent from your families of origin.
That's a big one.
Now, with kids, it's all about discipline. Setting external boundaries to help them build their own internal boundaries.
Right. And the book makes a distinction between discipline, which is about teaching, and punishment, which is about, getting even.
Oh, right.
It's important to let kids disagree and practice setting their own boundaries without feeling like they're going to lose your love.
Yeah. And the book also contrasts different parenting styles, like being too permissive or too controlling. Neither of those is helpful.
Yep.
And it briefly talks about teaching kids to delay gratification.
At the right age, of course.
Right, yeah.
So in the workplace, some common boundary problems are taking on too much work, having the wrong priorities, conflicts with bosses, expecting your job to be everything to you, and taking work stress home. The book really emphasizes taking responsibility for your own workload and setting limits on your time.
Right. And then there's our relationship with ourselves, our internal boundaries. The book talks about things like eating, money, time, what we say, sexuality, and substance abuse. It's about taking accountability for when we're out of control and getting support to gain some control. It also encourages embracing failure as a learning experience and being open to feedback.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
And finally, our relationship with God, with a higher power.
Right.
The book explains that even God has boundaries. We need to respect that.
Right.
God's choices the times when the answer is no. It emphasizes that while God is ultimately in control, he also respects our boundaries, our free will, and lets us experience the consequences of our choices.
That makes sense. So what happens when you actually start trying to set boundaries?
Yeah.
The book warns us that people might resist.
Oh, yeah, they will. It explains that when you start setting boundaries, other people's anger is usually about their own discomfort, not because you're doing something wrong.
Right.
And the book gives some tips for handling that anger. Stay calm, create some space if you need to, and don't get pulled into their drama. It also talks about guilt tripping. That's just manipulation to get you to give in. Don't over-explain. You don't have to justify your boundaries.
That's good advice.
Yeah.
And there might be actual consequences.
Sure.
Like in the book, when Brian started standing up to his dad reacted badly.
It happens.
The book says to think of this as part of becoming free, taking control.
It's like growing pains.
Right. But the book also talks about our own internal resistance,
Oh, yeah.
that fear of rejection or that urge to sabotage ourselves.
It's a real thing.
And the book has this process for overcoming it. First, admit where you've been boundaryless. Then see that resistance, that fear. Get some guidance, talk to people you trust, figure out what's really scaring you. Let yourself grieve that loss. And then move forward.
I like that. It's a good process.
So how do you know if you're actually getting better at boundaries? The book says you might start to feel resentful when people cross your boundaries, even little ones. That means you're more aware. Another good sign is that you might find yourself drawn to people who are good with boundaries. The boundary lovers who respect your no.
Right. Those are the people you want in your life.
And get this, feeling guilty can actually be a good sign too. It might mean you're breaking those old patterns of always saying yes.
Yeah.
It's like a growing pain.
Right. Change is hard.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the goal of all this is maturity.
Okay.
Being able to love people well and do good work. And the book also points out that respecting other people's boundaries is good for relationships too. It helps us to care more and be more empathetic.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And the book has some great stories about people whose lives were transformed by setting boundaries, like Yan and Ben, whose marriage went from constant fighting to mutual respect.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and Sherry, who finally got control of her time and energy.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Life is always going to be messy, but having boundaries makes us more resilient. We can handle those challenges better.
Absolutely. So to wrap up this deep dive, boundaries are essential.
They really are.
They're not selfish. They're about taking care of yourself and having healthy relationships. And you have the power to change things by using these principles. Hopefully this has been a helpful conversation full of those aha moments.
Absolutely. And as you think about all this, I want you to consider something. Think about a relationship or a situation where you always feel drained, resentful, or taken advantage of.
Okay.
What's one small no you can practice saying this week in that area?
That's a great question to think about.
Yeah.
Because saying yes to the things that really matter starts with being able to say no.
That's the truth.
Well, possibilities might open up for you. We hope you keep exploring these ideas. This deep dive is just the beginning of taking control of your life through boundaries.
Exactly.
So keep learning and growing.
Keep setting those boundaries.
It's true. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see